our stuff?
Yes, you can, and the webinar is live.
Okay.
This
is Bill Betancourt with the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and welcome to today's Get Real webinar. Before we get started, a few logistics. For the best sound, we ask that you call in from a landline, and if possible, not use the speakerphone function, and also avoid using a cellular phone or cordless phone, because that sometimes impacts the sound quality. Also, if you're having any sound issues, sometimes if you hang up and dial back in, that will help to clear those things up. Reminder that this is a webinar that's being recorded, and afterwards we will send out the link for the webinar, and you can also access the recorded webinar on our website, www.cssp.org. During the webinar, please send in questions using the function on the screen on the control panel. And after the webinar as well, if you have questions during the question and answer session, please send them in. There'll be a follow-up email from the webinar requesting you fill out a brief survey, and we really appreciate your responding to that survey. It helps us to continue to develop webinars for the field. So now, let me introduce you to the three presenters for today's webinar. Stephanie Perrin is the director of the LGBTQ Community Center R-Space located in Hayward, California. Stephanie has worked with youth and community-based social service agencies for over 10 years and has extensive knowledge and expertise in working with historically marginalized and underserved groups of youth, including lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning youth, youth of color, and runaway and homeless youth. Jorge Hernandez is a former foster youth from the San Francisco Bay Area. Having majored in gender studies and ethnic studies, they utilize their knowledge to inform their work outside of the university for the benefit of those who are most marginalized and underserved. They currently work as a community health educator in Oakland, California, and they organize around housing, healthcare, immigration, and youth rights. Calvin Fairmans is an emancipated Alameda County, California foster youth who has been actively involved in the queer youth community since 2006, having been involved in community work that includes survey development, HIV/AIDS-related support groups, and outreach programs. He believes that true empowerment comes from challenging assumptions about sexuality and gender. Welcome to you three, and we look forward to this webinar. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, this is Stephanie, and we're here to talk about beFIERCE, which is a toolkit for providers who are working with LGBTQ foster youth that is being launched out of our space today. So it's really exciting to be here with you all. I'm going to give you a little context to how the tool was made and tell you about how we're going to do the webinar today, and then Calvin and Jorge and I together will sort of go through and take you through the tool. So beFIERCE is really a tool to empower providers to actively support queer and trans foster youth. We opted to call this tool beFIERCE because the name inspires some action. It's more of a verb than a noun. And what we're really hoping is to inspire systems change in the foster care system and how queer and trans foster youth are treated by helping providers to build authentic relationships with queer and trans youth and identify everyday practice shifts that they can employ to better be allies to queer and trans foster youth. We also are hoping that this tool is going to support providers in taking a real holistic view of foster youth, because what we've found in putting this together is that queer and trans foster youth often feel like they get a one-dimensional look at them, that people just see them for one sort of fragmented or siloed off piece of their identity, instead of looking at them as whole and complex, beautiful people. So we're hoping that this tool helps to give people the tools to create that shift in how they're viewing queer and trans foster youth. And then some of the logistics of how this tool was made is that we were funded by the Walter S. Johnson Foundation, which is great, and that we put this tool together by doing lots of focus groups with queer and trans foster youth in the Bay Area, and also with providers working with queer and trans foster youth in the Bay Area. We also put out a national survey to gather more feedback from providers and young people. So really a lot of the content that you'll see in this tool comes directly from the experiences and the expertise of queer and trans foster youth and also providers who are working with them. Some other logistics about the tool to know are just, and I know this might be a little bit small, but you're going to get the link so that you can download all of this, is that beFIERCE is an acronym, so the letters in FIERCE stand for something. They stand for frames, so what frames do providers use to view LGBTQ foster youth, and what impact do these perspectives have in providers' work with LGBTQ foster youth? The I stands for intersections. How do the intersections of all aspects of a queer and trans foster youth's identity impact their experiences? And how must we as providers account for that as we support queer and trans foster youth? The E is for engagement. So what does authentic engagement with queer and trans foster youth look like, and why does it matter? The R is for resources, because a lot of the information we gathered from providers is that they want more resources and how to best support LGBTQ foster youth. C is for critical conversations. How do providers raise challenging subjects with their colleagues and others who are supporting LGBTQ foster youth? And E is exploring self. Why is it necessary for providers to engage in self-reflection and explore their connection to LGBTQ foster youth? So we'll be going through the tool in sort of that chronological order, and then have some closing statements, and then have time for questions at the end. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Jorge to give a little bit of context about why this tool is important.
Cool. So this is Jorge speaking now. I hope that y'all can hear me pretty clear. So I really wanted to just talk a little bit about why this is important, and talking from my personal experience. I was in the foster care system for 5 years, and in those 5 years I was in 21 different placements. And a lot of the reasons as to why I was in so many placements is because folks did not have the tools in order to best support me as a queer youth of color in the foster care system. And just really looking at this tool, I honestly believe that my experience would have been a lot different if these best practices would have been implemented throughout my time in the foster care system. So I think it's a really, really great tool. I'm really happy to see it actually come full circle and that we're doing the webinar. And I hope folks can actually utilize this to best serve LGBTQ youth in the foster care system.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to go over frames first, and again, frames is for the F in FIERCE. And when we're talking about frames in the toolkit, we're talking about perspectives or lenses that are informed by youth experiences and their identities, as well as experiences and identities of the providers themselves. And so we ask providers to really look at the different frames that LGBTQ youth, foster youth, carry with them, as well as the ones that they come into the work with. And we talk about frames as being impacted by identities and experiences in the toolkit, and we give a whole list. And some of those identities and experiences are referring to racial identity, family history, language, mental health, and sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. And so we really, really focus on how frames influence the behavior that foster youth display, and then also the ways in which a provider has the power to really deal or negotiate with these behaviors. Two different frames, which are one, a behavioral frame, which is pretty basic and is a pretty band-aid kind of solution to behavior, really asking what did you do and focusing on behavior, which doesn't necessarily get to the root as to why youth are acting out a certain way. And so we encourage folks to really take on a trauma-informed frame, which really looks at what the youth experience has been, to really be able to deal with that trauma and to hold that trauma for them. And the example that I we'll be giving for this is, while I was in foster care in GLASS, Gay, Lesbian, Adolescent Social Services House in 2003, I experienced a lot of bullying in school, and so I would come home with a really bad attitude, just angry all the time, and ironically, this was an LGBT house, but they didn't really have room to really hold that for me. They really focused more on like, oh, you're being rude, you're being loud, you're not participating in the activities, instead of really asking me like, what was your day like, right? And I think that came from an assumption that because I was in an LGBT house run by LGBT staff, that was enough. And that just shows that actually having LGBT staff working with LGBT foster youth is not enough. We also actually need to develop ways to relate to the youth in order to be able to best serve them, right? And so that's what we have for frames. It obviously has a few more slides, but we can move on to intersections now. And I think this one's great. This is probably one of my favorites in the whole toolkit, because this part that I'm going to say in the beginning is not necessarily in the toolkit, but whenever I talk about intersections, I really like to contextualize where this framework comes from. So when we're talking about intersections, we're really evoking a theoretical framework that was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 80s to try and capture the complexity of experiences of Black women when it came to experiencing disproportionate amounts of racialized and gendered violence. And so this is really useful when talking about foster youth, LGBTQ foster youth, because they also have intersecting identities within this system, this institution of the foster care system, and it really impacts the way they show up, right? The frame that they end up coming with. And it really is a call to providers to really also pay attention to intersections and understand that there is also actually not one universal LGBT foster youth, and that's not what we're trying to do with this toolkit. We're trying to get folks to really pay attention to the specific particularities of the youth that they're working with. And so we have this really great image that has a young person with all of these different intersecting identities that affect their experience around HIV status, language, mental health, racial, ethnic, and cultural identities, and really calling you to think about how is it that we can best support these youth and really make sure that we see them as whole, complex individuals, right? Not just foster youth, not just LGBT, but also, queer youth of color from working class backgrounds, with disabilities, and HIV, or having HIV, And so, again, I really want to emphasize using like personal examples. Again, when I was living in GLASS, the LGBT foster group home, my sexual orientation was constantly validated and affirmed. But when it came to things around language, I was actually not allowed to speak Spanish on the phone to my family because there was an assumption that was stated that I could possibly be planning to run away or talking about drugs or sex or things that were inappropriate. And that was a perfect example of providers really not seeing me as whole and supporting me as a Spanish-speaking queer foster youth, right? And this inevitably created more stress and trauma for me to the point where I actually ended up leaving that house. As much as I thought it was great because it was for LGBT youth, it ended up actually not really serving me the way that it was supposed to. And so then we also give a few tips on how to really approach this work with an intersectional analysis, right, and practice. And some of those tips are really recognizing and affirming all of the identities that the youth that we're working with have and carry with them. And we need to really do this because all of these identities and intersections in the end inform the needs of these youth. So if we can't recognize these intersections, then we're actually not going to best serve them, right? And then another tip, which is really, really great, is really being able to stay up to date on current events that may impact LGBTQ communities or communities of color, as well as other communities, because this could really, again, also impact the way young people are showing up. When I was in foster care in Fresno, there was all of this stuff going on around anti-immigrant backlash and all of these developments of like immigrant detention centers. And that really freaked me out, right? My parents were undocumented, and here I was far away from them, and I was constantly worrying about these things, and that wasn't something that was necessarily held or supported or that I was able to talk to, right? Because again, sometimes folks are just like, you're queer or you're foster youth, you don't have all of these other complex things about you, but we do. And so that's what we have for intersections. Again, there's a lot more tips, and it does sound like a lot, right, trying to stay up to date with things, but again, as Stephanie was saying, this fierce is a verb, right? Be fierce is a verb, and we're really calling folks to take action and to be pragmatic around the ways they approach things, right? Because there's no cookie cutter LGBTQ youth with all these intersectionalities. They vary from place to place and like person to person.
And maybe if I could add in, this is Stephanie, just one more thing about intersections. It's just that you know, the experiences of queer and trans youth, both in and out of the foster care system, are really often shaped significantly by the intersections of race and sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And so this is not a statistic or fact-heavy document, but we did include some facts that I think are, or some statistics that I think are worthwhile sort of saying out loud here. Here that queer and trans youth are estimated to represent just 5 to 7% of the nation's overall youth population, but they're 13 to 15% of young people who are currently in the juvenile justice system or the juvenile injustice system, depending on how you look at it. And of those youth, about 60% are Black or Latino. So we can really clearly there see a link between race and sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. Also that the life expectancy of a Black trans woman is 35 years old, and that there are about 1.5 to 2 times as many LGBTQ youth living in foster care as LGBTQ youth estimated to be living outside of the foster care system, and that queer and trans youth are disproportionately placed with group homes and congregate care facilities and not in foster homes or family-based settings. And then probably a statistic many of you are familiar with is that up to 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ. So just we wanted to include some statistics to try to really concretize that experience. But I think we're going to turn it over to Calvin now, who's going to talk about E for engagement.
Hi, hello, this is Calvin. We're going to talk about E for engagement. I want to talk about, I guess, why does really authentic engagement work? I mean, how can you get, why does authentic engagement work for foster youth, I guess? We got some of these tips from beFIERCE focus groups. So these are coming from real live youth. Some tips from the focus groups is be vulnerable, be real with youth. Some youth, like coming from my real experience, I was in a lot of placements too. I think I was in 11 placements. I was disconnected with my family and I should say shut down. So really engage me. Like you really have to be real, to be visible as an ally. It really is important in what you do and stick up as a provider. And it's really important if you stick up people, especially if they're being up or harassed or being called a fag. You have to be visible as an ally. Another tip is to engage with youth as participants in their own life and view them as experts in their own life. Ask questions. And youth really like when providers are really persistent. And totally. Another tip is to be upfront about the limits of confidentiality. Sometimes, as a youth that sat at a lot of placement meetings, a lot of confidentiality lines has been crossed, such as HIV status has came out in these placement meetings, such as HIV status and like coming out to provide to do placement. I feel like providers should be really upfront, confidentiality at all times with youth. it's really important to really engage these youth and to have some type of relationship. You may not get them one time, you have to build on for youth. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is Stephanie again, and I can just say that having been debriefed on the youth focus groups after they happened, but being upfront and clear about the limits of confidentiality was one that came up repeatedly from lots of young people. A lot of young people who had been receiving therapeutic services would talk about that they didn't actually really understand when confidentiality would be broken. So many of them reported, that they were talking about sort of past self-harm attempts or things like that, or talking about a difficult time in their life, and that a provider would misinterpret and think that there was an actual safety issue, and break confidentiality without having a conversation with the young person about the potential of breaking confidentiality. So I know that a lot of providers, at the start of services, will go over the limits of confidentiality with young people, but it became really clear through these focus groups that it was important to be talking about the limits of confidentiality all the time. And then one of the things that we're seeing a lot in our work in Alameda County is the real struggle or balance between holding a young person's confidentiality and wanting to try to find good placements for them and things like that. And so I think that oftentimes when confidentiality around a young person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression is broken, it's often because a provider is trying to suss out a good home for that young person, right? Trying to figure out if a home or a placement is going to be safe. But I think it's really important for us to recognize as providers that it's not our role to break confidentiality of a youth or disclose their identity to anybody. It's really a youth's choice who they want to be out to and when and how they want to be out to somebody. So one of the things that came out of these tips is really encouraging providers to have real conversations with their young people about what's going on, and to really view young people as experts in their own lives and experiences, and to recognize that they likely really know what's best for them, and that if we can partner with them in figuring that out, then we're going to have a much better chance of supporting them in their dreams. One youth said, "See what strength we have. We are a force in the world. See us like that." And I can also just say that one of the things that we've come to know at our space through our work with young people is that how we respond with young people and how we build relationships with young people is probably the most critical piece of the work that we're doing. This tree image sort of shows that there are these roots that we all have. There are these things that shape us, these experiences we've had, these family histories, these traumas we've experienced, our identities and values. Young people come in with all of these roots, and we don't necessarily, as providers, have any sort of say or control in that, right? This is just their history and their experiences. But what we do have control over as providers is thinking about our interventions and how we want to show up and care and attend to LGBTQ youth. So the right side of the tree, that is a lighter green color, sort of shows these interventions that providers might use that could that have a high level or likelihood of leading to negative outcomes. So things like treating LGBTQ young people with bias by labeling them and seeing them in this one-dimensional way, by ignoring a youth's experiences and needs, by being distrustful of them, by treating them with fear or violence or assumptions, through our own lack of knowledge around LGBTQ needs, by focusing only on a young person's behavior, by showing them rejection around their identity, or just sort of even apathy or disinterest in who they are. So what we've seen at our space is that when providers are responding to young people in that way, we're seeing an increase in self-harming behavior, suicidality, and suicide attempts, and underutilization of mental health and other support services, including physical health care services. We're seeing a lot of involvement in the criminal and justice system, overrepresentation in group homes, high rates of placement changes and moves, disproportionate rates of homelessness, unsafe sexual behaviors, a lot of AWOLing and running away, a lot of substance use, and dropping out of school. In contrast to that, what we found is that if we can treat our young people with acceptance and affirmation, if we can hold a holistic view of their experiences and needs, if we can be non-judgmental and non-shaming, if we can treat young people with just basic kindness, if we can show that we're safe for them and that we have resources to support them and that we can show up for them as an ally, if we can be trauma-informed, and if we're just really interested in youth's well-being and can do that, then we see a lot more positive outcomes for young people. So we see young people who are working and in school. We see them being linked to resources and getting their needs met. We see them utilizing healthier coping skills that they've identified. We see them building trusting relationships with their providers and taking on leadership roles and asking for help when they need it, which is such a really hard thing to do for many of us. We see them dreaming about what's their life and what it can be and connected to their communities and sometimes connected to birth families, but also building chosen families. And above all, we see them really loving themselves. And so a lot of what beFIERCE is really trying to do is push providers to use the interventions on the left. And then we're going to, I think, move into talking about resources, and Calvin's going to lead that conversation too.
Hi, it's Calvin again. I hear a lot from youth that they really want tangible, more and more tangible resources that actually be it. The really important ones, especially ones, are housing. How are you supposed to survive without housing, get up and be a full citizen without housing, especially for aftercare, housing after foster care. I'm really another resources is youth development programs. How are we supporting these youth to get jobs after? What is their employability like? Are they getting bank accounts? Besides the programs and set, are you personally helping these youth? And just like I said, there's social power, need more social capital to build networks, stuff like that. All these youth are empowered and need empowered. They need to build connections with providers to have connections. It's really super important to have resources.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, Calvin, that you hit on that's really important is that, the list that you all have in beFIERCE, this is just a starting list of resources for you, right? So when we did our national survey, what providers overwhelmingly said is that they want resources to be able to share with their young people and share with their colleagues. And so we just chose some that we use a lot here related to trauma-informed care and relationship building, some statistics and sort of basic information around LGBTQ and foster youth, and then some concrete resources for queer and trans youth, caregivers, and families. But I think, Calvin, what you're saying also is that that this list isn't enough, right? That we have to, not at all, right? No. And so it's really, just like we're saying beFIERCE is a verb, we're really hoping that providers will look at this list as a real starting point and then start building connections with the resources in their communities. One of the things we've seen at our space is that it's really unlikely that a young person is going to follow up on a resource we give them if we don't know the resource directly. So it's really different if I'm like, hey, go to this health center, they'll hook you up, as opposed to saying, hey, go call Jorge at this health center. He's amazing. He's such an ally to our space. I know him. He's going to treat you well. And we, and Jorge and I have that connection. So then I can call Jorge up and say, hey, I'm sending you this young person. They're amazing. Things like that. We really want to inspire and encourage you all to build deep connections in your own communities for resources that could be important for LGBTQ foster youth. So that might mean going outside, the queer center in your community or something like that, but really looking at other needs that young people, that queer and trans foster youth have, and building relationships with those organizations too. Yeah, so we're going to switch on over to critical conversations with Jorge.
Hey, so yes, this is Jorge again. And so, yeah, critical conversations is a C in beFIERCE. And in the toolkit, we really focus on thinking about how providers raise challenging subjects with their colleagues and other folks supporting LGBTQ foster youth. And this is very important because ultimately we would like to see like an entire system change, right? Where there, like the entire foster care system was really catering to the needs of all youth and also LGBTQ foster youth. But until that actually happens, we really need to start having these conversations amongst each other as providers with staff and, again, other folks who support these LGBT foster youth. And yeah, because this is essentially the best way we can reach a point to where like all of us as providers are best serving the needs of the youth. And I think that the crucial part of this, again, is really putting the work like on the providers themselves and not on the LGBTQ youth, because that, again, could be very triggering for folks. And it's also just a lot of emotional and psychological labor to constantly be asking youth like what they need. Yes, it's great, and it's really important to take into consideration what these we're working with need, but I think we can always go the extra step and take initiative and figure out, okay, what does it mean to be an ally? What does it mean, again, to go out and talk about finding resources for these youth? And we have a few tips on here, which is really, again, remembering the whole your purpose as a provider and why we're choosing to have these critical conversations, and what you want the end outcome to be. Because sometimes, again, we don't want to conflate critical conversations with things like gossip, right? A critical conversation is not trying to figure out whether an LGBT youth is queer or trans, or personal things like that, right? If you know that, or if you don't know that, then that's probably because the youth hasn't, like, you know, they don't trust you, they don't want to let you know. But it's really more about challenging, like, negative stereotypes that folks go up to serve LGBT youth with, right? Like, oh, you're probably into sex work, you're probably using substances, you're probably vulgar and perverse. And so it's really, again, like talking across to other providers. And an example that I have is when I was living in Fresno, one of the young persons in foster care who did not identify as LGBT, actually he dressed up with a wig, a really long blonde wig one Halloween, and he actually was wearing the wig, and he wore it for like 2 months after Halloween, like every day. And so for some of the staff, they felt uncomfortable, they felt this was wrong. But then, fortunately, the folks who were running the group home kind of really brought in all the staff, and including myself, because I was one of the only openly LGBT youth in the house. I mean, really, we started having a conversation around sexuality and gender orientation, and how actually someone who is perceived as cis male wearing a wig actually doesn't really say much about their sexual orientation or their gender identity, right? And that's a conversation that really helped move the staff in a direction where it was like, well, this person isn't actually hurting anyone. They're not hurting themselves. They're just wearing a wig for whatever reason. They had many reasons, but it was essentially something that was, again, dealt with in a way that was appropriate, and there was no shaming. But what I think was awesome about it is that the staff were actually able to have a conversation about it. And there were disagreements, there were some agreements that ultimately the youth was allowed to wear the wigs until he just kind of grew out of it after a few months. And I think that that's just a really, really crucial part, again, right? Like having these conversations and making sure that they are critical and that it's not gossip and that there's an actual, like, reason for them, right? And so some of the tips also that we have here is when you're having these conversations amongst each other, ask clarifying questions instead of making assumptions, find common ground, think about timing and location, right? Make sure that if you're going to have this conversation and it's about like a young person, you're really intentional about if you have it in front of other youth, right? Because that probably should not be happening. Or, you know, you don't want to, again, have this conversation with a young person without letting them know in front of the whole group home, right? And really thinking about the relationship with the person that you want to have these critical conversations with, and thinking like, is this worth it? And again, like, what is my ultimate goal in having these conversations? And the ultimate goal should really be to learn how to better serve the LGBTQ plus youth that you're working with.
Yeah, and I think another example of where a critical conversation can have a tremendous impact is when we're thinking about placement for LGBTQ foster youth. Because I think a lot of times, right, like people are under a lot of pressure to find placements really quickly for foster youth. And we want to make sure that, you know, queer and trans foster youth are being placed in homes or that their placements are safe and affirming and accepting of their identity. And so, you know, I think one of the ways that we can do that is that if we are working with a colleague who's working to place LGBTQ youth, to really be like taking the time to have a conversation with them and seeing if they need any support and like assessing whether or not a home or placement is a safe place. Because where young people end up and the placements that they have and the experiences they have there really directly impact, you know, their lives in major ways. And so that's just one example also of where one provider could have a critical conversation with another. And I think we're going to move into the final part of beFIERCE, which is really, so beFIERCE closes with this idea of exploring ourselves as providers and really taking time for self-reflection in the work. I can say for myself as a provider who's been doing this work that there are a lot of demands on the time of providers, as many of you may also feel, right? That often in our daily work we're being tasked with lots of job duties and with, you know, we're usually really busy, our schedules are changing all the time, and it can make it really difficult to take the time to slow down and actually think about our connection to this work and the impact of this work on our lives and the impact of our lives on this work. Because we're doing this work with young people, which is such an honor and a privilege that we get the chance to do this work with young people. It's relational work, right? And so we can't go in, I mean, we're not blank slates as people, and we don't go in like that. But if we don't take the time to actually explore what's going on for ourselves and really critically self-reflect about how we've been impacted by this work and how we are impacting LGBTQ youth through our work, then we're probably going to burn out faster. We're probably going to maybe make choices that have a negative impact on our young people without really meaning to or without knowing that we are. So it feels really, really important that we take time to do this. So beFIERCE closes with all these different journal questions that that aren't here just for show, but are really here for folks to take on critically and think about and reflect on. And we really encourage people to think about the idea that self-reflection doesn't have to be a solitary process. You could consider bringing these questions to team meetings that you have, or for any of you who might be doing supervision for folks, to bring these questions into supervision and exploring these with your supervisee. Or doing group supervision with any you know, clinical interns. This would be a great thing to bring in. And that you can really build in accountability partners for yourself with other folks at work so that you can be doing this continuously. Because the thing with self-reflection is it's not like a one-time deal. Like we can't fill out this like little journal section and then be done with it, because how we feel and how we react to things and the experiences that we have are always evolving and changing. And so it became really important. I think Jorge said it towards the beginning of the webinar that like we really want this tool to empower providers and really have providers take on the role of like shifting the experiences of LGBTQ in the system. That like it's not about LGBTQ foster youth having to shift things, but it's about us as providers having to do a lot of work to shift our frames and to shift our behaviors and how we show up for young people. And so if we're going to do that, we need to really take the time to critically self-reflect, and we need to be doing that on a regular basis. So I won't read all of these questions because it doesn't make sense to do that, and you're going to get a copy of this. But I do think that some of the poignant questions have to do with what kind of power dynamics exist in my relationship with LGBTQ foster youth, and how do I talk about those, right? Because it might not just be a power dynamic around sexuality or something, but it might be around race, or it might be around age, because we're all adults as providers mostly, and we're mostly working with young people, so there's an adultist piece there too. I think another one that can be important to think about is how do I hold myself accountable to LGBTQ foster youth? Because we do have an accountability, we do have to be accountable to the young people we serve, and what does that actually mean to show up as accountable adults in their lives? And then finally, I also think, we referenced trauma-informed care and the idea of young people coming in with trauma histories, even by virtue of being part of the foster care system. And so I think thinking about how we as providers, or how our agencies or the foster care system in general might trigger, reinforce, or repeat trauma in the lives of LGBTQ foster youth is really important and a really big question to tackle. But yeah, this is how beFIERCE sort of closes with this commitment to self-reflection. And I'm going to let Jorge give a few closing statements. He's going to close us out, and then we have time for questions, I think.
Cool, thanks. So this is Jorge. So yeah, I guess not to repeat too much of what Stephanie said already, but again, this whole toolkit is, again, not an endpoint. The way that we provide services for LGBTQ foster youth is also not an endpoint. It's a constant process, right, that changes from day to day and from youth to youth that we're working with. And so, I'm really excited for this tool to be out there and for folks to actually be able to use it and to understand that, again, this tool should be applied appropriately, and that just, again, it changes from geographic location for the youth that you're working with. And there's just no one way to apply this, but I think just starting to use it in some way, shape, or form will definitely better the experiences of LGBT foster youth in the system. Yeah.
I think that's what we've got for you, Bill.
Okay, thank you. So a few questions, not too many so far. I'm sure folks will have more as they start looking closer at the tool, and they can always contact you if they have those kinds of questions. But you reference providers as your audience for the tool. Can you kind of talk about who you include in that category?
Yeah, the tool is meant to be pretty broad, and I think, in general, this is a toolkit that was made for providers working with LGBTQ foster youth, but really I think that this is also a toolkit that could be applied to any provider working with any young person, because it's really about relationship building with young people. And so, the providers that we had in focus groups and the providers that we were thinking of specifically with this tool were folks really embedded in the foster care system. So thinking about, placement workers and primary child welfare workers, thinking about child welfare supervisors and how they might use this tool to help supervise their staff. We also were thinking about staff at a group home. We're thinking about foster parents, FFA administrators, but then also all types of people who just come into contact with young people. So this could be a tool that's given to school administrators or to teachers or to folks in other community centers or to healthcare providers. It's really meant to have a broad audience, although there are definitely some specific references to child welfare that folks who aren't in child welfare may not necessarily pick up on.
Okay, that's helpful, yeah. So did you do any focus groups with child welfare caseworkers?
There were a couple child welfare caseworkers who came to the provider groups. So the way we did the provider focus groups was sort of advertising to a wide, sort of that whole list of providers that I just gave. And we decided to have them be sort of intersectional focus groups instead of pockets of certain groups of people, because we wanted to see if that would help the conversation and sort of push it to a new level. So there were definitely caseworkers who were from Alameda County especially, who were here in some of the focus groups and were able to give some really valuable feedback for the tool.
Mm-hmm. And then in the area of confidentiality and information and the sensitivity of that, and being careful not to out young people in the context of trying to both have information that you can do case planning, but also be sensitive about it. Knowing how the system works and that controlling for that can be challenging. Did you get any kind of input from legal folks around the document in that area?
Yeah, we didn't specifically get input around that, but I know that Bill, you and some other folks worked on the SOGI guidelines, sharing guidelines.
Right.
I can't remember if we linked in here or not, but if we didn't, we should. Yeah, most of our information really about that came directly from young people and talking about what they wanted and needed, felt like was lacking. And I think a lot of the young people agreed that like that they wanted to be asked about their sexual orientation, gender identity, and their gender identity, right? Like that it felt bad when like that piece of who they were was left out, but that they really wanted to have more control over how that information was shared. Because a lot of times young people would say like, you know, a placement worker disclosed my identity to a placement without telling me, so I got there and it felt like a setup, and everybody knew I was trans, and I didn't know if I wanted to be out as trans at placement. So really thinking about that youth perspective, but I think what you're saying is really important to have that legal perspective.
Yeah, and it's a work in progress for us. You know, next week Allegheny County is going to talk about field testing those guidelines, and I'm sure we'll hear some of their thinking around the actual hands-on work they're doing with the guidelines around this area of managing information. Can you talk a little bit about the realities of the system, you know, are, as you well know, that nationally it varies in the experiences of young people in the system. And it's not always safe for folks to be out, and sometimes they don't choose to. They may want to stay in a home in the closet to just get through the system, even though it's not an affirming home, but it's manageable. So for people who work with young people who are not out, you know, do you feel like this tool provides guidance, or are there aspects of that that you think need further development for providers?
I mean, I think that like a lot of this tool really talks about like, you know, working with young people who are out in a lot of ways, or that like and so I think like that's a good point. I think that what we do see is that young people might be out to like the person, like to their caseworker or to one person, but not out to everybody else. And so, and I think because this is a tool about building relationships with young people, like potentially this tool can, you know, like help providers figure out how to create safe space so that young people could come out if they wanted to, or know that this provider is an ally. But I hadn't thought about it from that perspective, though. I think that's interesting to think about, like providers who are working with young people who might be closeted. You know, and I think it's also like we have to like check our own assumptions as providers, right? Because we might think somebody's closeted, but maybe they're just doing them and like they're not closeted.
That's right. Too. And then another question for providers in rural areas where there aren't a lot of resources. Do you have any thoughts about ways in which they can take this tool and do things in areas like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like connecting, like do you mean in terms of like connecting to other resources or finding the resources in their community?
Yes. Right.
Yeah. So
or developing.
Or developing them, yeah. I mean, I think like definitely in the resource section, there's a lot of online resources to places that also have like youth chat rooms and provider chat rooms and things like that where folks can feel connected. Like I know that Gender Spectrum is listed on here, and they have a really like big online presence for young people and for families. So I think that's one way. But I don't know if I know the answer to building the resources in our own communities. I'd have to get my community organizer hat on and be thinking about that too. But I would think about like building relationships with folks like in neighboring communities too. That might be a useful thing to do.
I also think, this is Jorge, I also think, I feel whenever we talk about resources, we'll talk about like spaces and nonprofits, again, like all of these really big things, and this may be tied a little more to engagement, but I really also think, you know, I had been to places where there was actually no LGBT community center around, but really, you know, folks would give me like queer literature, right, and something like that. It's small, but it's like really important to have like a queer cultural production that actually reflected me to the point where I was like, okay, like there are people like me, and this is not wrong, or I'm not an anomaly. So even just little things like that, I know it's a lot smaller, but I really do think, you know, that kind of stuff goes a long way. Those kinds of things really helped me when I was in placements like in juvenile hall, throughout the foster care system, or, you know, like other placements that weren't necessarily that great. So that's what came to my mind. Really
Thank you.
Good.
So that's it for the questions. And so Stephanie, from here you're going to have a link available for us to send out to the network, right?
Yeah, we'll have a link available today, and that link is for the whole publication, which is downloadable and looks really lovely when you print it out, and has other tools that we didn't even go over in here, like the cycle of oppression and things like that. So that link, I'll get it to you today, Bill, and then it can be sent out.
Okay, we'll be sure to send it out to everyone and also post it on our website. So thanks so much to the three of you, Jorge, Calvin, and Stephanie, for this webinar and for the work you've done to develop this tool. We appreciate it.
Thanks, y'all.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.